The frozen hand clutched a photograph, a woman and two children smiling in a Berlin garden. The hand's owner would never see them again. He lay in the snow outside Stalingrad, one of 300,000 German soldiers trapped in a pocket of frozen hell. Above him, the stars shone with cruel indifference. This was supposed to be the war that made Germany great forever. Instead, it became the war that destroyed everything. But how did the mightiest military machine ever assembled end up broken and defeated? The answer lies in a series of battles that changed the world forever. In 1940, Germany looked unstoppable. Poland had fallen in less than a month. France, the great military power that had defeated Germany in World War I, collapsed in just 6 weeks. German tanks rolled through Europe like an unstoppable tide of steel. Young German soldiers wrote letters home saying the war would be over by Christmas. Their leaders promised them an empire that would last 1,000 years. But empires built on conquest have a way of crumbling faster than anyone expects. The first crack appeared over the skies of Britain. After conquering France, Hitler looked across the English Channel at the British Isles. Britain stood alone, battered and isolated, seemingly ready to fall. Hitler's plan was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, bomb Britain into submission, then invade. The German Luftwaffe was the most powerful air force in the world. They outnumbered British planes nearly 3-1. What could possibly go wrong? The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. German bombers escorted by fighters crossed the Channel day after day, expecting to crush British resistance quickly. First, things looked grim for Britain. Airfields were bombed, planes destroyed on the ground, pilots killed faster than they could be replaced. But the British had a secret weapon that the Germans didn't fully understand: radar. Those mysterious towers along the British coast could detect incoming German planes from miles away, giving British fighters precious minutes to scramble and intercept. Day after day, British Spitfires and Hurricanes rose to meet the German attackers. The sky over southern England became a battlefield where young men fought and died at 20,000 feet. German pilots who had felt invincible over Poland and France now watched their comrades shot down in flames. The Luftwaffe lost planes faster than factories could replace them. By September 1940, Hitler made a fateful decision. He switched from attacking airfields to bombing London and other cities, hoping to break British morale. It was a catastrophic mistake. The bombing of London, the Blitz, killed thousands of civilians, but it gave the Royal Air Force time to recover. British fighter strength actually increased. By October, Hitler quietly postponed the invasion of Britain. By 1941, he cancelled it entirely. For the first time, the German military had failed to achieve its objective. It seemed like a small setback at the time. Britain was isolated, unable to threaten Germany directly. But Hitler had learned the wrong lesson. He thought he didn't need to finish off Britain before moving on to his next target. That decision would haunt him. Unable to conquer Britain, Hitler turned his gaze eastward to the vast Soviet Union. His generals warned him this was madness. Don't fight a war on two fronts, they pleaded. Germany had lost World War I partly because it was fighting enemies in both the East and West simultaneously. But Hitler had convinced himself that the Soviet Union was weak, led by incompetent leaders, and ready to collapse at the first blow. We only have to kick in the door, he declared, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. On June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in human history began. Operation Barbarossa sent 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 600,000 vehicles smashing across the Soviet border on a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. In the first weeks, it looked like Hitler's confidence was justified. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and captured. German armored columns raced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, crushing resistance. By autumn, German soldiers could see Moscow's golden church domes on the horizon through their binoculars. Then winter arrived. November brought rain that turned Soviet roads into rivers of mud. German vehicles sank and stuck. December brought snow and temperatures that plunged to 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers froze to death in their summer uniforms because someone in the supply chain had assumed the war would be over before winter. Tank engines wouldn't start in the cold. Machine guns froze and jammed. Soldiers lost fingers and toes to frostbite. And still, impossibly, Soviet armies kept appearing. Fresh divisions from Siberia, trained to fight in winter conditions, threw the exhausted Germans back from Moscow's gates. Hitler's quick victory had turned into a nightmare. But he refused to retreat. As winter turned to spring and then summer in 1942, Hitler planned a new offensive. This time, instead of attacking Moscow, he would drive south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. And on the way, he would capture a city on the Volga River, a city that bore the Soviet dictator's name, Stalingrad. What happened at Stalingrad would become the most important battle of the entire war. Hitler became obsessed with capturing the city simply because of its name. Stalin ordered it defended at all costs for the same reason. What followed was urban combat so brutal and savage that soldiers measured their life expectancy in hours, not days. The city became a landscape of ruins where German and Soviet soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes occupying different levels of the same shattered building. The Germans pushed deeper into Stalingrad through September and October of 1942, grinding through Soviet defenses meter by bloody meter. By November, they controlled 90% of the city. Victory seemed so close. Then disaster struck. On November 19th, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, attacking the weak Romanian armies protecting the German flanks north and south of the city. Within 4 days, Soviet armored columns had broken through and met behind the German forces, completing an enormous encirclement. The entire German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was trapped. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the surrounded army, begged Hitler for permission to break out while there was still a chance. Hitler refused. The army must hold its position, he ordered. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, made an impossible promise. His aircraft would supply the trapped army by air. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons of supplies every day. In the best conditions, the Luftwaffe could barely deliver a tenth of that. In the brutal Russian winter, with Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns shooting down transport planes, Göring's promise became a death sentence. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, German soldiers starved and froze. They ate their horses, then anything else they could find that might provide sustenance. Wounds became infected and gangrenous without medicine. Men shot themselves rather than endure another day of frozen misery. Still, Hitler refused to let them surrender. On January 30th, 1943, he promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, knowing that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in history. It was Hitler's way of ordering Paulus to die fighting. Paulus surrendered the next day anyway. Of the 300,000 men trapped at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The disaster couldn't be hidden from the German people. For 3 days, German radio played only somber funeral music. But the defeats were just beginning to cascade. While Stalingrad was unfolding, another catastrophe was developing in North Africa. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, had been fighting British forces across Libya and Egypt. By October 1942, his Africa Corps faced the British Eighth Army at El Alamein in Egypt. Rommel was sick, outnumbered, and desperately short of supplies. The British had more tanks, more planes, more ammunition, more everything. After 12 days of fighting, Rommel's forces were broken and retreating westward. Then came another hammer blow. On November 8, 1942, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. Now Rommel faced enemies from both directions. Hitler, stubbornly refusing to give up North Africa, poured more troops into Tunisia. It was pointless. By May 13, 1943, the last German and Italian forces in Africa surrendered. Another 250,000 soldiers marched into captivity. Germany had lost 2 entire armies, one at Stalingrad, one in Tunisia, within months of each other. Summer 1943 brought Hitler's last major offensive in the east, the Battle of Kursk. German intelligence had identified a large Soviet bulge in the front lines near the city of Kursk. Hitler planned to cut it off with simultaneous attacks from north and south, trapping the Soviet armies inside. It would be the largest tank battle in history, But the Soviets knew the attack was coming. Soviet spies had penetrated German planning. The Red Army transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress, with minefields, tank traps, artillery positions, and defensive lines stretching for miles. The German attack began July 5th. For days, massive German tanks, the new Tigers and Panthers, pushed into the Soviet defenses. But instead of the breakthrough victories of 1941, the Germans gained only kilometers while suffering devastating losses. At a place called Prokhorovka, hundreds of tanks from both sides collided in a massive swirling battle. When it ended, the German offensive was exhausted. Hitler called it off. Immediately, the Soviets counterattacked along the entire Eastern Front, beginning an advance that wouldn't stop until Soviet soldiers were raising their flag over Berlin. That same summer, British and American forces invaded Sicily, then jumped to mainland Italy. Mussolini, Hitler's Italian ally and fellow dictator, was overthrown and arrested. Italy switched sides. Hitler now had to divert precious troops and resources to occupy Italy and fight the Allies advancing slowly up the Italian peninsula. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the situation was only going to get worse. Every day and every night, British and American bombers appeared over Germany. The British bombed at night, dropping incendiaries that created firestorms consuming entire city blocks. The Americans bombed by day, targeting factories, oil refineries, and railways. German cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen were reduced to rubble. The beautiful city of Dresden was destroyed in a firestorm that killed tens of thousands. Germany's industrial capacity was being systematically demolished from the air. Factories couldn't produce tanks if they were heaps of rubble. Troops couldn't move if the railways were cratered. The noose was tightening around Germany from all directions. Soviet armies drove west through Ukraine and Belarus. Allied forces ground north through Italy. And everyone knew the biggest blow was still coming. The Allies would invade France. Hitler just didn't know where. He fortified the entire Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain, building massive concrete bunkers, laying millions of mines, positioning troops to throw any invasion back into the sea. But would the Allies land at Calais, the closest point to England? Or somewhere else along the vast coastline? They came at Normandy. On June 6, 1944, a date known forever as D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history hit the beaches of Normandy in northern France. Despite all of Hitler's fortifications and preparations, the Allies established a foothold. Part of the reason was that Hitler was asleep that morning and his staff was too terrified to wake him with bad news. Part of it was that Hitler had convinced himself the real invasion would come at Calais, and that Normandy was just a diversion. But mostly it was because Germany simply didn't have enough strength to defend everywhere at once while also fighting in Russia and Italy. Within weeks, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. By the end of August, Paris was liberated. British, American, and Canadian armies raced across France, reaching Germany's western border by September. For a brief moment, some thought the war might be over by Christmas 1944. But Germany wasn't finished yet. Hitler scraped together reserves for one last desperate gamble in the West. In December 1944, German forces attacked through the snowy Ardennes forest in Belgium, creating what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. For a few days, it looked like the Germans might actually reach the port of Antwerp and split the Allied armies. American forces were surrounded at Bastogne. When the Germans demanded surrender, American General McAuliffe reportedly replied with a single word, "Nuts." Once the weather cleared and Allied air power could operate again, the German offensive was doomed. By January 1945, the Bulge was eliminated. Germany had spent its last reserves, over 100,000 casualties, thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed, for absolutely nothing. The Western Front began to collapse rapidly. In the east, the situation was even more catastrophic. On January 12, 1945, the Soviets launched a massive winter offensive across Poland. They had spent months building up forces. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, artillery lined up as far as the eye could see. The German defenses in the east were paper-thin, manned by whoever was left. Old men, teenage boys, remnants of divisions destroyed in earlier battles. The Soviet steamroller crushed them in days. By late January, Soviet forces had reached the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. Millions of German civilians fled west in absolute panic, creating a refugee crisis of staggering proportions. Families abandoned their homes with whatever they could carry, trudging through snow and ice, trying to stay ahead of the advancing Soviet armies. Thousands froze to death on the roads. Others died when Soviet submarines torpedoed overcrowded refugee ships in the Baltic Sea. It was a humanitarian catastrophe, the direct result of the aggressive war Germany had started. Hitler retreated to his bunker deep beneath Berlin and descended into complete madness. He moved phantom armies on maps, ordering divisions that no longer existed to counterattack positions they couldn't possibly reach. When generals dared to tell him the truth, that Germany was beaten, that continuing the war was suicide, he screamed at them or had them arrested for defeatism. He declared that if Germany lost the war, the German people deserved to perish because they had proven themselves weak. He ordered a scorched earth policy. Destroy everything, bridges, factories, power plants, so the advancing enemies would inherit nothing but ruins. Thankfully, many German officers ignored these insane orders. The final battles of World War II in Europe were desperate and pointless. American and British forces crossed the Rhine River in March 1945 and drove deep into Germany from the west. Soviet armies surrounded Berlin in April. The German military threw whoever they could find into the fighting. Boys as young as 12 and old men in their 60s were handed rifles they barely knew how to use and told to stop armies that had just conquered half of Europe. They died by the thousands defending a regime that had led their nation to absolute ruin. In Berlin, as Soviet artillery shells exploded in the streets above his bunker, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief ceremony. He dictated a rambling final statement blaming Jews, communists, and everyone except himself for Germany's defeat. Then, on April 30, 1945, he shot himself. His body was burned in a shell crater outside the bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was finally over. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, had lasted exactly 12 years. What went wrong? How did a military machine that seemed unstoppable in 1940 end in such complete disaster just 5 years later? The answer is complicated, but certain patterns emerge clearly. First, Germany took on too many enemies at once. By invading the Soviet Union before finishing off Britain, Hitler created the two-front war that had doomed Germany in World War I. By declaring war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, he added American industrial might to his list of opponents. By 1943, Germany was simultaneously fighting Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, three of the most powerful nations on Earth, collectively controlling far more resources and manpower than Germany could ever hope to match. Second, Hitler's ideology led to catastrophic strategic decisions. His belief in racial superiority made him underestimate his enemies repeatedly. He thought the British would collapse. He thought the Soviets were led by incompetent leaders commanding inferior troops. He thought the Americans were weak and decadent. He was wrong every single time. His racism also created unnecessary enemies. German forces treated Soviet civilians with such shocking cruelty that populations which might have welcomed them as liberators instead fought back as partisans. The Holocaust diverted trains and troops desperately needed at the front to instead murder millions of innocent people, which provided literally zero military benefit. Third, Hitler couldn't delegate or trust his professional military officers. He had been a corporal in World War I and fancied himself a military genius. Sometimes his instincts worked. The invasion of France succeeded partly because Hitler overruled cautious generals. But more often, his interference was disastrous. He ordered armies to stand and die rather than retreat and regroup strategically. He diverted forces to capture cities for symbolic reasons instead of strategic objectives. He launched offensives when defense made more sense. A competent leadership structure might have salvaged something from Germany's position. Hitler's erratic, ego-driven decision-making turned defeats into catastrophes. Fourth, Germany's enemies learned and adapted while Hitler did not. The British developed radar technology and cracked German codes. The Soviets learned from early defeats, reorganized their forces, and developed tactics and weapons that matched or exceeded German capabilities. The Americans brought to bear industrial capacity so vast that they could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. One American factory complex could produce more aircraft than all of Germany's factories combined. Meanwhile, Germany squandered resources on weapons like the V-2 rocket, a technological marvel that had virtually no strategic value. And finally, Germany simply ran out of everything. By 1945, the country was running out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of trained soldiers, out of time. German tanks sat immobile for lack of gasoline. German pilots flew training missions in gliders because aviation fuel was unavailable. New recruits received only weeks of training before being thrown into combat. The much-vaunted German war machine was literally grinding to a halt. By May 1945, Germany lay in absolute ruins. Major cities were landscapes of rubble. Millions of Germans were dead, millions more homeless and displaced. The nation was occupied by foreign armies and would be divided for the next 45 years. The 1,000-year Reich had ended in 12 years of complete destruction. And that soldier whose frozen hand clutched a family photograph outside Stalingrad? He was just one of millions who died fighting for a lie, the lie that conquest brings glory, that one group of people is superior to others, that the military might make right.